Every royal court in the galaxy has, somewhere in its lowest, quietest corridors, a person nobody important ever bothers to look at twice. On Ethelgard, that person mopped floors for 4 years, apologized whenever he bumped into furniture, and moved through the palace with the careful, practiced invisibility of a man who genuinely wanted nobody to remember his name. The Kaelan nobility considered him a harmless curiosity, a human novelty kept mostly for the appearance of cosmopolitan sophistication. Nobody in that palace ever once asked what he had done before he picked up a mop. If they had, they would have discovered a career that no royal household on Ethelgard was remotely prepared to have walking their halls. When mercenaries with a telepathic scourge weapon and a signed contract from inside the palace's own high command finally came for the queen's children, they walked directly past the one servant nobody had ever bothered to properly research, expecting nothing from him at all. They should have asked. Because in the 4 hours that followed, that quiet, apologetic janitor became something the Kaelan Reach had no word for, something that turned an elite 12-man kill squad into a memory and reminded an entire empire of a truth every species eventually rediscovers the hard way. The most dangerous person in any room is very often the one everybody stopped bothering to notice. Blood on the white marble of the royal promenade was the very first thing Sovereign Isolde saw when the blast doors of her dropship hissed open. The capital city of Ethelgard wasn't merely under attack. It was a graveyard. The orbital defense grid had been sabotaged from the inside, and the citadel her family called home, the same citadel that had stood, by legend, impenetrable for 11 generations, was burning in 3 separate quadrants. But it wasn't the fall of her empire's ancestral seat that made her twin hearts stop cold in her chest. It was the silence coming from the direction of the royal nursery. Her children were in the east wing, the same wing where the smoke hung thickest. Isolde drew her ceremonial blade, her telepathic aura a chaotic storm of dread she couldn't fully suppress even with decades of royal discipline behind her. A single, terrible thought repeated itself over and over in the space behind her eyes. I am too late. 3 hours earlier, Thomas Wright had been dragging his mop bucket down the immaculate, sunlit corridor of the East Wing. He was 58 years old, with salt and pepper hair, a permanent limp in his left knee, and hands scarred and calloused in a way that suggested a life spent doing considerably more than custodial work. In the grand hierarchy of the Kaelan Reach, humans occupied a curious, largely decorative niche, structurally fragile, non-telepathic, short-lived, mostly employed in maintenance, logistics, or heavy labor considered beneath a proper Kaelan's dignity. Thomas liked it that way. He liked being invisible. He liked the quiet rhythm of polishing marble floors, the gentle hum of the Citadel's climate systems, and the distant, melodic laughter of the royal twins drifting down from the nursery each afternoon. He was currently wiping down a crystalline vase near the nursery doors when Commander Sterling marched past him down the hall. Sterling was a high-ranking Kaelan military officer, usually adorned in gleaming ceremonial armor befitting his rank. Today, however, he wore unmarked tactical gear, and behind him marched 12 figures clad in heavy black void suits, carrying military-grade plasma carbines. Thomas kept his head down, scrubbing at an already spotless section of floor, but his eyes tracked their reflection in the polished marble. Something was wrong. The formation was too tight, too disciplined, and they were bypassing every standard security checkpoint along the corridor without so much as a glance. Sterling stopped at the entrance to the East Wing. He reached into a tactical pouch and produced a small metal cylinder, twisted the top, and a faint blue light pulsed weakly from the device. Inside the nursery, the head nanny, a massive Kaelin woman named Vala suddenly shrieked. It wasn't a sound of physical pain. It was a psychic scream that tore into the physical world and kept tearing. She dropped to her knees, clutching her skull, golden eyes rolling back in her head. In the corridor, two Kaelin guards convulsed and collapsed, blood seeping from their ears and noses within seconds. Thomas felt nothing at all. To a human, a neural scourge device was simply an inert piece of metal, a party trick that happened to be killing everyone around him. "Sweep the rooms," Sterling ordered his assembled squad, his voice a cold, guttural murmur. "Leave none of the royal bloodline alive. The new regime begins today." Thomas froze behind a decorative pillar, his heart hammering hard enough that he was momentarily certain someone would hear it. The twins, we. Ray in the playroom, just beyond the shattered outer doors, and every trained instinct he'd spent 10 years trying to bury, was already screaming at him that there was no time left to think this through properly. He had spent the last decade trying to forget who he used to be. He had buried his past quietly on a backwater colony world and traded a set of Terran orbital dropshock trooper armor for a janitor's jumpsuit, promising himself, after a particular engagement he still couldn't think about directly, that he would never again pick up a weapon. As he listened to the heavy boots of the assassins marching steadily toward the room where 4-year-old twins Lysander and Aurelia were currently hiding, something in Thomas simply, quietly broke open. It wasn't a decision, exactly. It was closer to an old, dormant reflex finally, fully waking up. The Kaelin had spent 4 years assuming humans were harmless because they couldn't read minds. What they never understood was that humanity's real weapon had never been telepathy or claws or armor plating. It was an adrenaline-soaked, hyper-adaptive survival instinct forged across an evolutionary history the Kaelin genuinely had no equivalent for. Thomas snapped the wooden handle of his mop over his knee. The last assassin in the formation paused near his pillar to check the charge on his rifle. Thomas stepped out of the shadows without a sound, and with brutal, terrifying precision drove the splintered end of the mop handle upward, through the unarmored joint beneath the man's jaw and straight into his skull. Before the body had fully finished collapsing, Thomas caught the falling plasma carbine, stripped the dead man's combat knife from its sheath, and dragged the corpse into the shadows. He checked the weapon's charge. Full. "All right, Tommy," he thought, his breathing already slowing, his 10 years of quietly aching joints seemingly forgotten under a sudden, massive flood of adrenaline. Time to go to work. Inside the nursery, Sterling was aiming his rifle at the heavy reinforced door of the playroom, where the twins had triggered an emergency lockdown. The durasteel was already beginning to glow under the heat of a breaching torch. "Hurry it up," Sterling barked. "The Sovereign's ship breaks orbit in an hour. I want their heads on pikes before she lands." Then the lights in the east wing died entirely. The assassins activated their low-light visors, sweeping their weapons through sudden darkness. "Who cut the power?" Sterling demanded. A fine, corrosive mist began hissing down from the ventilation shafts above. Thomas's own heavy-duty floor solvent, pumped directly into the local air scrubbers. It wouldn't melt through their armor, but as it settled across their visors, it began eating away at the optical sensors, blinding them within seconds. "Contact, we're blind," one assassin shouted, clawing uselessly at his ruined visor. A plasma bolt tore through the darkness and struck him squarely in the chest, dropping him instantly. "Return fire!" Sterling screamed, firing blindly into the shadows, plasma bolts scorching the walls and igniting priceless tapestries. But the shooter was already gone. Thomas moved like something that had once been trained to move exactly this way, in exactly this kind of dark. He remembered the rooms lay out precisely, where the floorboards didn't creak, where the blind spots sat. He flanked a pair of assassins firing toward the doorway, grabbed the nearest one by the back of his helmet, and drove his stolen knife through the base of his neck. He used the dying body as a shield as the second assassin turned, absorbing 3 plasma bolts meant for Thomas, before Thomas raised the carbine and finished him. Sterling watched in genuine mounting horror as his elite kill squad was systematically dismantled by an enemy he could neither see nor properly identify. "Use the thermal scanners," he ordered. "Find them." "Sir," one of the remaining mercenaries said, his voice tight with panic. "The thermal signature, it's too small. It's too cold. It's not Kalen." Thomas, crouched behind an overturned mahogany desk, checked his rifle's charge. 10 shots left. 6 hostiles remaining, including Sterling. His breathing was heavy, and a stray plasma burn had seared his left shoulder down to the muscle. He ignored it entirely. He glanced at the melted playroom door. He could hear the twins crying softly inside. "Nobody touches the kids," he whispered, his eyes hardening into something cold and utterly unfamiliar to anyone who'd ever handed him a mop. He pulled a chemical light stick from his pocket, cracked it, and hurled it across the room to draw fire, then charged in exactly the opposite direction. Queen Isolde stepped through the blasted doorway of the nursery, smoke stinging her eyes, her ceremonial blade held in a white-knuckled grip, prepared to die avenging her children if it came to that. As the smoke slowly cleared, the scene in front of her defied every rational expectation she'd carried through the door with her. The vast, opulent nursery was completely destroyed. The walls were scorched black by plasma fire. The massive crystal chandelier had shattered across the floor in a million pieces, and then there were the bodies. She counted them. 10 heavily armored Kalen mercenaries, elite killers. Everyone lay in grotesque, broken positions, their armor pierced by precise plasma fire, or worse, their bodies shattered by brutal, intimate close-quarters violence. One mercenary was pinned to the wall by a shattered piece of a heavy oak table. Another had his helmet caved entirely in by what appeared to be a solid brass fire extinguisher. This wasn't the work of a security team. This was the work of an apex predator. "Lysander," Isolde called out, her voice cracking. "Aurelia." "Mama." The sound came from behind a hastily constructed barricade in the corner, heavy metal cabinets, a reinforced desk, blast-proof glass pried from the windows, all piled together into a small, improvised bunker. Isolde ran to it and threw a heavy cabinet aside with sudden, desperate strength. Huddled in the corner, covered in soot but entirely unharmed, were her twins. They clung to each other, terrified but alive. Isolde dropped to her knees, pulling them both into her chest, sobbing openly for the first time in longer than she could remember. "You're safe. By the ancestors, you're safe." "He protected us, Mama," Lysander whimpered, pointing a trembling finger toward the center of the ruined room. "The quiet man." Isolde looked up. Standing in the middle of the devastation, leaning heavily against a marble pillar, was Thomas Wright. His gray jumpsuit was drenched in a mixture of Kalen blue blood and his own red blood. His left arm hung limp at his side, badly burned. In his right hand, he still held a Kalen combat knife, its edge dulled and chipped from repeatedly striking armor. At his feet lay the body of Commander Sterling, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. Isolde stood slowly, her children still clinging to her legs, and stared at the frail-looking man who cleaned her floors. The man who apologized when he brushed against a table. The man the Kalen nobility had for 4 years treated as a mildly charming pet. Thomas, she said, utterly bewildered. You did this. Thomas spat a mouthful of blood onto the marble floor. He looked exhausted, pale, but his eyes carried something entirely new. The cold, calculating stare of a man who had once stared directly into the abyss, and against his own better judgment, smiled back at it. "They brought a telepathic jammer, Your Majesty," he said, his voice raspy and stripped entirely of formal titles. "Knocked out your guards, melted a couple brains, but I ain't got the hardware for that kind of headache." He limped over to Sterling's body, ripped the neural scourge device from the dead commander's belt and tossed it to her. 12 of them, Vornak's syndicate mercenaries, if I had to guess. Sterling hired the best. "And you?" Isolde asked, looking around the ruined room. "You killed them all with a mop and a knife." Thomas let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Had a plasma carbine for a bit, battery died, had to improvise, humans are good at that." Isolde stepped closer, her telepathic senses finally recovering enough from the earlier shock to function properly. She reached out with her mind, expecting the usual void humans typically presented to telepathic contact. Instead, she felt a tidal wave of suppressed trauma, tactical genius, and a terrifying, icy rage that made her physically step back. "Who are you, Thomas?" she demanded, her voice carrying the full authority of the throne. "What are you?" Thomas sighed, letting the combat knife slip from his fingers, clattering against the floor. He leaned against the wall, sliding down slowly until he sat on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. 30 years ago, before I came to this sector," he said quietly, looking up at the ceiling, "I was a gunnery sergeant in the Terran Orbital Dropshock Infantry. We were the ones sent in when diplomacy had already failed and orbital bombardment wasn't politically viable." He glanced down at the twins, his hard eyes softening a fraction. "I did things, Your Majesty, things that keep me awake most nights. I retired because I was tired of scrubbing blood out of my uniform. I just wanted it to be quiet." He looked at Sterling's corpse with open disgust. "But these bastards tried to hurt the kids, and I've just discovered I'm not quite finished being a monster." Heavy boots echoed in the corridor. Lieutenant Grayson, a human exchange officer serving on Isolde's staff, burst into the room with a squad of loyalist Kaelin guards, weapons raised, then froze entirely at the sight of the carnage. "Sovereign, what happened here?" Grayson breathed. Isolde looked at Thomas, who was clearly struggling now to keep his own eyes open. "Get the royal medics here immediately," she commanded, her voice ringing with total authority. "If this man dies, I will personally hold every physician in this citadel responsible." Thomas managed a weak, blood-stained smile as his vision began to swim. "Just make sure I get a raise, Your Majesty. Mops ain't cheap." His eyes rolled back, and he slumped fully against the wall. Thomas woke to the sterile, ozone-scented air of a high-tier Kaelin trauma ward, suspended in a field of warm, bioluminescent medical gel that was aggressively knitting his torn muscles and seared skin back together. For one terrifying second, his mind threw him 30 years into the past, a medevac shuttle over burning ground, the screams of his squad mates crackling through a failing comms channel. He gasped, thrashing weakly against the suspension field. "Easy, Sergeant," a calm voice said. "You're secure." Thomas blinked the stasis fluid from his eyes. Queen Isolde stood at the edge of the grav bed, having traded her blood-stained ceremonial robes for a dark armored tunic. 2 hulking Kaelin loyalists flanked her, though they kept a careful, noticeably cautious distance from the human floating between them. Lieutenant Grayson sat nearby, looking like a man who had just discovered his favorite grandfather was secretly an apex predator. "The gel will deactivate momentarily," Isolde said, waving a hand over a console. The field dropped, and Thomas settled onto the firm mattress beneath, testing his shoulder cautiously. The agonizing plasma burn was gone, replaced by a patch of smooth, faintly pink new skin. "How long was I out?" he asked. 18 hours, Isolde replied, her golden eyes studying him with obvious, unresolved intensity. The physicians were astonished. They said a Kalen would likely have died from the sheer shock of your injuries alone. Your biology proved aggressively resilient. "We're stubborn like that," Thomas said, sitting up. He looked toward Grayson. "The kids." "Safe, Sergeant," Grayson said quickly. "Secured in a bunker beneath the Citadel. Nobody gets in or out without the Sovereign's own biometric seal." Thomas exhaled, staring at his own scarred hands. "Good." Isolde stepped forward, dismissing her guards with a small flick of the wrist. The heavy doors sealed shut, leaving the three of them alone. "We extracted Commander Sterling's memory core before his neural pathways fully degraded," she said, her aura darkening with barely restrained fury. He was not acting alone. The neural scourge was military-grade, heavily restricted equipment, and the Vornak Syndicate mercenaries were paid through a proxy account linked directly to the Ethelgard High Council. Thomas looked up sharply. "A coup." "A slaughter," Isolde corrected coldly. "I was meant to return home to a dead family, a broken spirit, and an empire begging for stability. Lord Regent Alistair, my own second-in-command, has been quietly championing a treaty with the Kryn Ascendancy. I refused it. It seems he decided my bloodline was simply an obstacle standing in the way of his ambitions." "So what's the play?" Thomas asked. "I cannot simply arrest him," Isolde admitted, a flicker of genuine vulnerability crossing her otherwise stoic expression. "The Taurian Guard is compromised. Sterling commanded 3 battalions personally. I don't know who among them remains loyal to the Crown and who's been quietly bought." Grayson pulled up a holographic projection from his own data pad, a massive, jagged warship rotating slowly in blue light. "Worse," he added, "deep space telemetry just picked up a Vornak dreadnought holding position at the edge of the system. If Alistair realizes this attempt failed, he'll simply signal them to breach orbit." Thomas studied the hologram. "You're in a box, Your Majesty. Your military's compromised, your enemies are already inside the gate, and your kids are still in the crosshairs." He paused, thinking it through. "Which brings me to you, Thomas," Isolde said, stepping closer, her imposing height meaning she still looked down at him even as he sat up. "I researched your file, the real one, not the forged civilian record you gave the Labor Ministry." She tapped a console, and a new file opened. "Thomas Wright, serial number 884 Bravo 9er, Terran United Space Command, 1st Battalion Orbital Dropshock Infantry. You didn't simply fight in a difficult campaign. You led a 3-man infiltration team into an enemy-fortified staging ground and disabled an entire planetary defense cannon using nothing but kinetic explosives and close-quarters combat." Grayson stared at Thomas, his jaw slack. "You were special forces." "I was a lot of things," Thomas said, looking away from the display. "I worked for a government, then I worked for the private sector. I spent 20 years doing the things diplomats pretend don't happen, so humanity could keep a foothold. But here, I retired because I was tired of it." "I'm sorry to ask this of you," Isolde said, her voice dropping to something close to a whisper. "I'm sorry to pull you back into the dark, but my people are telepaths, Thomas. We feel the emotions of everyone we fight. We hesitate, we empathize. It's our greatest strength as a civilization." She placed one hand over her twin hearts. "But right now, it's a fatal weakness. I need someone who doesn't hesitate. I need someone who doesn't feel the psychic screams of the enemy. I need the ghost you used to be." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. He thought of the twins hiding behind that improvised barricade. He closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and when he opened them again, the tired old janitor had, quite deliberately, stepped aside. "Lieutenant Grayson," he said, his voice suddenly carrying the sharp, undeniable authority of a career gunnery sergeant. Grayson snapped to attention entirely on reflex. "Sir." "Contact the Terran embassy. Tell them we need access to the diplomatic Black Site vault. General Dynamics ships their ambassadors with a break-glass war crate. I know for a fact." Thomas rolled his newly healed shoulder and looked at Isolde. "You want a monster, Your Majesty? Fine, but we do this my way. No stun batons, no honorable duels. We're about to teach the Ethelgard High Council exactly why humanity was quarantined for the first century of contact with this galaxy." The war room of the Citadel was a masterpiece of Kaelin architecture, vaulted ceilings, inscribed with the names of 1,000 victorious generals. Right now, it felt considerably more like a tomb. Lord Regent Alastair stood at the head of the holographic tactical table, flanked by 3 heavily armored Taurian commanders. He was an older Kaelin, his silver neural stalks marking advanced age and considerable telepathic power, his robes deep midnight blue, his face set in a carefully composed mask of manufactured grief. "The Sovereign is sequestered in the medical wing," Alastair announced to the assembled ministers. "The tragedy in the East Wing has shattered her mind. She speaks of phantoms and shadows. Until she recovers, I am invoking the Regency Protocol. The military falls under my command." Murmurs of fear and reluctant agreement rippled through the room. "First order of business. Lower the planetary defense grid. We need to allow Vornak Syndicate medical and relief ships to enter orbit to assist in our—" The heavy durasteel doors of the war room didn't merely open. They were violently blown inward by a directed, shaped charge, the massive doors slamming into the marble floor with a deafening crash and a cloud of pulverized stone. The Taurian commanders instantly drew their plasma sabers, the hum of superheated energy filling the room. Through the settling dust, 2 figures walked in. Queen Isolde strode forward, radiating a telepathic aura so intensely furious that several minor ministers dropped instinctively to their knees, clutching their heads. She wore full combat armor, silver plating gleaming, her ceremonial longsword resting at her hip. But it was the figure beside her that made the Taurian guards freeze in place. Thomas Wright was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the gray jumpsuit, replaced by matte black United Space Command heavy assault armor, engineered to absorb light and radar. His helmet was tucked under one arm, revealing a grim, scarred face. Over his right shoulder hung a massive, ugly piece of hardware, a General Dynamics M76 heavy magnetic accelerator rifle, a railgun. "Regency Protocol denied, Alastair," Isolde's voice boomed, amplified by the chamber's own acoustics. Alastair recovered his composure quickly, though his eyes darted nervously toward the heavily armed human. "Sovereign, you are unwell. The trauma of losing your children." "My children are alive," Isolde said, the words striking the room like a physical blow. Alastair's mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second, his telepathic aura spiking with genuine, unmistakable panic. It was all the confirmation Isolde needed. "Buy my new first sword," she continued, gesturing to Thomas. One of the Taurian commanders, a hulking Kaelin named Vane, scoffed loudly. "A human! You would replace the elite Taurian guard with a fragile primate, Sovereign? This is madness." "He killed 12 of your Vornak assassins with a mop handle and a kitchen knife," Isolde stated flatly. The room fell dead silent. Vane looked at Thomas, assessing his black armor and the crude, blocky weapon slung over his shoulder. "Lies," Vane snarled, igniting his plasma saber. No human possesses the reflexes to defeat a Kaelin warrior. I challenge this janitor for the right to stand beside the queen. Thomas said nothing at all. He simply dropped his helmet to the floor. Vane lunged, moving with terrifying speed, to an alien eye, a blur of silver armor and burning blue energy. To Thomas, who had spent decades fighting hyperkinetic insectoid species in zero gravity, Vane telegraphed his strike from a mile away. As the plasma saber swung down in a brutal arc meant to cleave him in two, Thomas simply stepped slightly to the left. The blade hissed past his ear. Before Vane could correct his own momentum, Thomas brought the heavy steel stock of his railgun up in a brutal, bone-shattering arc, smashing directly into the soft, unarmored cluster of neural stalks at the back of Vane's neck. Vane didn't even scream. The sheer trauma to his nervous system shut off his brain instantly. The 9-foot Kaelin warrior collapsed in a heap of useless armor, his saber skittering harmlessly across the floor. The fight had lasted exactly 2 seconds. The other 2 Taurians stepped back, their weapons visibly trembling in their grip. Thomas racked the charging handle of the railgun, its magnetic coils spooling up with a terrifying, high-pitched shriek. He leveled the barrel directly at Lord Regent Alastair. "Now," Thomas said, his voice a low, gravelly growl, "who else has a problem with my resume?" Alastair raised his hands, his face draining of color. "This is an outrage. An alien holding a weapon to the Lord Regent. Guards, kill him." None of the guards moved. They were looking at Vane's unconscious body, then back to the human currently aiming a weapon capable of punching through a tank directly at their commander. "Lord Alastair," Isolde said, stepping forward, "you are stripped of your titles. You are stripped of your telepathic rights. You will be confined to the deep cells for high treason." "You are too late, Isolde," Alastair spat, dropping the entire facade. He tapped a hidden sequence on his wrist gauntlet. "The Vornak dreadnought was waiting for my signal. I just gave it. They're dropping pods into the city as we speak. They have orders to level the citadel." The citadel abruptly, violently shook. The distant, unmistakable sound of atmospheric sonic booms echoed through the thick walls. The invasion had begun. Alastair smiled, bloody and desperate. "Your guards are dead or loyal to me. You have one human. You cannot stop an army." Thomas looked at the holographic tactical table. Red blips were multiplying rapidly across the city map, landing directly outside the palace gates. He didn't panic. He tapped his earpiece, opening a channel. "Grayson, package ready." "Ready, Sergeant," Grayson's voice crackled back, tight with adrenaline. "I managed to override the Citadel's automated defense turrets. They're offline, but sir, are you sure about this?" "Do it, son," Thomas said. He turned to Isolde. "Your Majesty, I suggest you get your ministers behind the blast doors." "What did you do, Thomas?" Isolde asked, watching the human calmly strap his helmet back onto his head, the visor polarizing to a featureless black void. "The Vornak use energy shields, right?" Thomas's voice was now mechanically altered by the helmet, cold and metallic. "Energy shields are great against plasma and lasers. Earth never adopted plasma weapons. We stuck with kinetics. We use heavy solid slugs traveling at Mach 7. He checked the gauge on his railgun. "Energy shields try to absorb a hit like that, and the kinetic feedback overloads the generator and cooks whoever's inside their own armor." Outside the war room, the Citadel's massive front gates exploded inward, and hundreds of heavily armed Vornak mercenaries began pouring into the courtyard, expecting no resistance whatsoever from the deactivated turrets. "I had Grayson reroute the power from your turrets," Thomas said, walking toward the shattered doors, heading straight toward the invading army entirely alone. I told the United Space Command Embassy that an allied head of state was under attack. They gave me access to an orbital strike platform. He paused, looking back at the terrified Lord Regent. We don't fight fair, Alistair. Welcome to the meat grinder. The grand courtyard of the Ethelgard Citadel, ancient stonework, manicured bioluminescent gardens, had become, in the span of minutes, a staging ground for an execution. 3 heavily armored Vornak Syndicate dropships had crushed the delicate flora beneath their landing struts. Hundreds of mercenaries poured out, energy shields shimmering with a faint iridescent purple hue. Their commander, a scarred veteran named Garrett, stepped down from the lead ship, expecting the automated turrets to already be firing. Form up, Garrett ordered. Sweep the lower levels. I want the Queen alive so the Lord Regent can execute her on the public broadcast. Kill everyone else. Then the shattered main doors of the Citadel groaned, and a single figure stepped out of the swirling dust and smoke. He didn't look like a Kalen Taurian. He wasn't 9 feet tall, and he didn't carry an elegant, glowing blade. He was a stocky, bipedal creature in matte black armor, carrying a brutally ugly, blocky weapon. Garrett narrowed his eyes, adjusting his optical zoom. A human? What is this, a joke? He raised his voice, amplifying it through his suit's external speakers. Drop the weapon, Primate, and you might live long enough to clean our boots. Thomas Wright didn't answer. He didn't monologue. He simply raised the M76 railgun, planted his boots on the marble steps, and pulled the trigger. The sound was not a civilized hum or a fiery discharge. It was a deafening, thunderous crack that broke the sound barrier, accompanied by a blinding flash of displaced air. A 50 caliber depleted uranium slug left the barrel at Mach 7 and crossed the courtyard in a fraction of a millisecond, striking Garrett's second-in-command squarely in the chest. His energy shield flared blinding white as it attempted to absorb the impossible kinetic transfer, and the generator on his back violently overloaded, detonating like a localized bomb. The round punched clean through the failing shield, through his armor, and out his back, throwing him into a stone fountain hard enough to shatter it. The courtyard fell into stunned silence. "Open fire," Garrett screamed, his arrogant composure shattering entirely. "Burn him to ash." A storm of green plasma erupted across the courtyard. Thomas dove behind a collapsed stone pillar, the rock hissing and popping as superheated plasma bit into it. He leaned out, tracking targets with ruthless efficiency. Crack. Another mercenary's shield burst into sparks. Crack. A heavy weapons specialist was thrown violently into a bulkhead. "Flank him," Garrett ordered, pointing toward the left garden. A squad of 20 mercenaries broke off, using jump jets to bound across the courtyard, seeking an angle behind Thomas's cover. Inside the Citadel's comm room, Grayson's voice crackled urgently in Thomas's ear. "Sergeant, 20 hostiles pushing your left flank. They're moving too fast for your fire rate." "I know, kid," Thomas grunted, slapping a fresh magazine of tungsten slugs into the railgun. "Is the package in position?" "It confirmed, sir, but the blast radius—" "I'm in shielded cover," Thomas said, his voice ice-cold. "Execute the protocol, drop the rods." In the cold vacuum of space, 300 kilometers above Ethelgard, a heavily classified, unlisted satellite belonging to the Terran military opened its ventral bay doors. It didn't fire lasers. It didn't launch missiles. It simply dropped 3 solid tungsten rods, each weighing 20 tons, Project Thor, known informally and grimly as the rods from God. Gravity did all the actual work. Impact in 3, 2, 1. Thomas curled tightly behind the stone pillar and braced his arms over his helmet. The sky above the courtyard didn't merely light up. It tore open, a shrieking howl ripping through the atmosphere as the tungsten rods superheated the surrounding air into plasma trails. The impact hit with the force of a tactical strike, and the ground heaved violently, throwing mercenaries into the air like discarded toys. The 3 Vornak dropships vaporized instantly, crushed flat against the bedrock. When the dust and smoke finally began to clear, the courtyard was gone, replaced by a glowing crater of fused glass and stone. Of the hundreds of elite mercenaries who had landed there, nothing remained but scattered, smoking pieces of armor. Thomas stood slowly, his boots crunching on glass. "Package delivered," he coughed into his comms. "Vanguard neutralized." "Copy that," Grayson replied, his voice trembling. "But sir, bigger problem." Above him, the sky darkened as the Vornak dreadnought, the Leviathan, descended slowly through the upper atmosphere, 3 kilometers of jagged black metal bristling with plasma batteries. A synthesized voice boomed across the valley. "Ethelgard Citadel, you have destroyed our vanguard. We will now reduce your palace to a crater. Surrender the Queen within 5 minutes, or we initiate an orbital glassing." Thomas looked at Isolde, who had stepped out into the ruined courtyard behind him. "They intend to burn the city," she whispered. "Millions will die." "We can't get the planetary shield back online," Isolde said. "Alistair used a biometric lock only he can undo, and if we force him under duress, the system detects the change in his neural resonance and permanently bricks the entire generator." Thomas looked up at the dreadnought. 5 minutes. He thought of the twins deep in their bunker below. He thought of an old, dirty tactic developed generations earlier, back when humanity had first faced enemies with vastly superior ships. "There's a play," he said finally. "It's a one-way trip if it goes wrong." He explained it quickly. A stealth-cloaked run in Isolde's own royal transport, hugging the dreadnought's thermal exhaust to mask their approach, boarding directly through a cut hull section, and planting a localized antimatter charge directly at the ship's reactor core. "Boarding a dreadnought alone," Isolde said, peeping his arm with surprising strength. "That is madness, Thomas." "I don't need to fight 1,000 mercenaries," Thomas said. "I just need to reach their reactor." "Then I am coming with you," Isolde said, drawing her ceremonial longsword and bringing the hilt to her forehead in a formal salute, a gesture reserved only for equals. "This is my world. These are my people. I will not hide in a bunker while a human janitor sacrifices himself to save us." Thomas stared at her, genuinely caught off guard, and then for the first time in 30 years felt something like a real smile tug at the corner of his scarred mouth. "All right, Your Majesty," he said, slamming his helmet back on. "Let's go steal a dreadnought." The gilded crest, Isolde's royal transport, locked its cloaking field into position and slipped upward through the smoke of the burning courtyard, threading a careful path directly beneath the Leviathan's massive thruster exhaust, where the chaotic radiation would mask their approach from even the dreadnought's own sensors. 2 minutes until the cloaking coils overheat, the pilot warned, sweat visible on his brow. "That's all we need," Thomas said, pulling a heavy, hazard yellow cylinder from his back compartment, stenciled with the words T-Havoc. He set the timer to 60 seconds, a localized, tactical antimatter charge, salvaged from a contract he'd worked a decade earlier and quietly kept, against every regulation, for exactly the kind of day he'd hoped would never come. They breached the hull through a cut section near the engineering deck, moving through the dreadnought's corridors like phantoms, Isolde's telepathic senses pinging ahead for patrols, Thomas neutralizing what few guards they couldn't avoid with brutal, silent efficiency. The reactor room itself was heavily defended, 10 cybernetically enhanced Vornak heavies standing guard, their pain receptors surgically stripped for maximum aggression. Countdown to the glassing is at 90 seconds, Isolde warned. Time's up, Thomas said, setting the charge's arming sequence and breaching the final door. They fought their way to the reactor core in a brutal, close-quarters melee, Isolde a blur of silver armor and plasma steel, Thomas grinding down heavies with railgun fire and improvised violence, and Thomas finally slammed the T-Havoc charge into the reactor housing, arming it with 45 seconds on the clock. "Bomb is set, run," Thomas roared. They fled through the ship's chaos, found an emergency garbage chute, and dropped through it into open vacuum just as the gilded crest, piloted back into position by a genuinely terrified but determined shuttle pilot, caught them on its extended cargo ramp. The T-Havoc detonated seconds later. The antimatter fed back on itself catastrophically, and the Leviathan's 3-kilometer hull buckled inward before shattering entirely into a spreading field of molten debris. Inside the gilded crest, the silence was absolute. Thomas pulled his helmet off, bruised and bleeding. Isolde looked at him, her priceless silver armor ruined and scorched, and then threw her head back and laughed, a booming, genuinely triumphant sound. "By the ancestors, Thomas," she said, "you humans are completely, utterly insane." "It's a survival trait, Your Majesty," Thomas said, managing a tired chuckle of his own. "Keeps the galaxy on its toes." 3 weeks later, the citadel of Ethelgard was already rising from the ashes of that single, catastrophic night. The conspirators had been rooted out entirely, and the Vornak Syndicate had formally withdrawn from the entire sector, terrified by whispers that the Kaelin Queen now kept a human weapon capable of erasing dreadnoughts from existence with nothing but a stolen bomb and sheer, bloody-minded persistence. Under the newly restored glass dome of the Grand Promenade, Queen Isolde held a formal royal commendation ceremony. Standing proudly before the throne was Thomas Wright, no longer wearing a janitor's jumpsuit, but the immaculate midnight blue dress uniform of a Taurian commander. Beside the throne, Prince Lysander and Princess Aurelia waved excitedly, and Thomas offered them a warm, subtle wink in return. As Isolde pinned the Star of Ethelgard to his chest, she whispered that his salary had been doubled, effective immediately. Thomas simply smiled and replied, quietly enough that only she could hear, "Much obliged, Your Majesty, but just so we're clear, I'm still not doing Windows." The Kaelin Reach would spend years afterward quietly revising every assumption it had ever made about the small, soft-looking species it employed to sweep its floors. Not because Thomas Wright had proven himself some kind of singular anomaly, but because, across the wider galaxy, in 100 other palaces on 100 other worlds, other quiet, unremarkable humans were currently mopping other floors, apologizing for bumping into other pieces of furniture, and waiting patiently for a day they sincerely hoped would never come. The truest lesson of that single, terrible night in Ethelgard's East Wing was never really about one exceptional man. It was about a species that had spent 10,000 years learning, over and over, in blood and fire and quiet, grinding necessity, that the most dangerous weapon in any galaxy was never the one you could see coming. It was the one standing quietly in the corner, holding a mop, waiting for a reason.